Welcome back to another installment of Literary Diss Tracks. So related to the previous video on Zora Neale Hurston and Richard Wright, today we have Toni Morrison, author of The Bluest Eye, Song of Solomon, Beloved, amongst many others, versus journalist and writer Bill Moyers. This one is particularly significant because it reflects and in some way generates a really huge paradigmatic shift in 20th century literature that resonates to this very day. So shortly after receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom, Toni Morrison is interviewed by Bill Moyers. Towards the end of the interview, Moyers poses the following question to Morrison, quote, "Is it conceivable that you could write a novel in which blacks are not center stage?" To which Morrison replies, "Absolutely." Moyers continues, quote, "You think the public would let you because the expectations are you've achieved such fame and made such a contribution by writing about black people in your novel that they now expect you to write about black people." Though Morrison responded very gracefully, the question very clearly perturbed her. In a 1998 interview with Charlie Rose, he brings up this very interview from 1990 and gives her a chance to respond. She begins by noting that writers like Leo Tolstoy and James Joyce, they write about race. So why is it that she, as a black woman writer, is the one constantly being posed the question about race? And from here, I'll let Toni Morrison speak for herself.
Because you see, the person who asks that question doesn't understand that he or she is also raced. So to ask me when am I going to stop, if I can, is to ask a question that, in a sense, is its own answer. Yes, I can write about white people. White people can write about black people. Anything can happen in art. There are no boundaries there. Having to do it or having to prove that I can do it is what was embarrassing or insulting.
So here, Toni Morrison is pinpointing the mechanics of whiteness that have so long plagued not just African-American literary production, but also all of American literary production. This notion that white authors, by virtue of their historical and structural privileges, possess no real racial marker and thereby occupy sort of a standard normative and universal perspective, whereas writers of color can only occupy their racialized perspective in the production of art. In other words, writers of color are responsible for producing texts that engage clearly and substantively with matters of race, while white writers, like myself, well, we can pretty much do whatever we please. But to really appreciate how Toni Morrison ultimately handles this question provoked by Bill Moyers, we require some historical and kind of theoretical context of how we even reached this critical juncture in literary intellectual history. So let's go back to the Harlem Renaissance. In particular, let's go back to 1925 with the publication of The New Negro, an anthology edited and collected by Elaine Locke and featuring essays, poetry, and fiction from writers of the time like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Countee Cullen, and Jean Toomer. This anthology is a must-have for any reader on your bookshelf. Elaine Locke's purpose for this anthology was to create an audience for and a tradition of African-American literary expression that, unlike some of their predecessors, did not require the explicit or tacit approval of a white middle-class readership. In other words, a distinctly African-American literary art form. With that objective in mind, it makes perfect sense then that most of the authors in the Harlem Renaissance where authors were focusing their artistic production on matters of race and blackness. This focus about writing about race and one's racial perspective was by no means prescribed upon them. Their exploration of blackness at this time was an art form really unto itself, and one that was revolutionary and hugely important, particularly in the fight for civil rights. And this is great for a time, but literature evolves because writers' interest evolves. So writers of color, standing on the shoulders of the giants of the Harlem Renaissance, desire to produce art that's not bound strictly to depictions and explorations of race relations. However, this was not often well received. Take, for instance, someone like James Baldwin, whose 1956 novel Giovanni's Room was criticized at the time for not depicting characters of color. So we see again this imprint of whiteness where white writers can produce whatever exists within their imagination, whereas black writers are expected to operate within the boundaries of their lived reality. And then they're subject to questions from someone like Bill Moyers asking why they only write black characters. So now we come back to Toni Morrison, who in 1992 has been thinking about these questions provoked by Bill Moyers and publishes a book called Playing in the Dark, an astounding work of literary criticism and an absolute must-read for any student of literature. For instance, and from a literary theory standpoint, the book details how what we know as hallmarks of American fiction, in particular like the rugged individualism, is predicated upon legacies of American slavery, which opened up the dialectic of free versus unfree in which individualism can operate. More germane to our purposes, however, is the introduction to the book, in which Toni Morrison poses a question that seems very much directed at Bill Moyers himself. Quote, "What does positing one's writerly self in the wholly racialized society that is the United States as unraced and all others as raced entail? What happens to the writerly imagination of a black author who is at some level always conscious of representing one's own race to or in spite of a race of readers that understands itself to be universal or race-free? In other words, how is literary whiteness and literary blackness made, and what is the consequence of that construction?" The answer to that question is very much implied. The consequence is a prescriptive model of literary aesthetics imposed upon black artists that is still felt to this day. Take, for instance, someone like Colson Whitehead. After the 2011 publication of his fantastic zombie novel entitled Zone 1, many readers and scholars alike began piecing apart the novel as a sort of racial allegory, despite only a few bare mentions of race at all. And regardless of these scholars' good intentions, it goes without saying that if Whitehead were a white writer, no one's going to apply that kind of lens to his work. On the theoretical level, what Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark gives us is a new way of approaching various theories related to race, such as critical whiteness studies and critical race theory, but also a language by which to interrogate these sort of issues when they present themselves. And Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark makes very visible this particularly nefarious double bind that persists to this day. Namely, if a black author chooses to write black characters, they run the risk of being perceived as narrow-focused or derivative or unimaginative, while also reifying this idea that black writers must write about their race. However, when they write outside of the question of race, they are then subject to being asked why they are ignoring their responsibility to produce art representing the whole of their race.